Hello, this is Kathleen Ralph, creator of the webcomic Hope and Harry. I know how important support is for creators, which is why I support Andy and Derek and the Comics Alternative through Patreon.
This is the Comics Alternative for young readers, reviews of Baba Yaga's Assistant and Sunny Side Up.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two PhDs talking about comics for young readers.
And this is a new segment of the Comics Alternative, one in which Gwen and I discuss comics for young readers. And we'll tell you more in a moment about who these young readers are. But let me say that the comics and young readers, that's a topic that we've been wanting to explore on the Comics Alternative for quite some time. So we're really excited about getting it started. And I welcome Gwen to the podcast and to the Comics Alternative family.
Well, thank you, Andy. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. And we want to get more into your background in just a few minutes. But first, before we do any of that, we want to let everyone know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the fine folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your pre-ordering comics needs. They have DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles for 40% off, and you'll find other publishers, their discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off. Sometimes the specials go to 45 to 50% off the cover price, and sometimes the discounts are even more impressive than that.
That's right, Andy. You know, this month there are some great bundles for kids at Discount Comic Book Service. For instance, for our Marvel comic readers, there's a wonderful bundle that they can get for under $5 that includes Ultimate Spider-Man Spider-Verse #1, Avengers Assemble Season 2, Lucky number 13, and Guardians of the Galaxy #2. And for our DC fans, this month's bundle includes 2 issues of DC Kids featuring the lovable and awesome and eternally hip Scooby-Doo and his friends for just $2.98. So head on over to Discount Comic Book Service for some great September Kids titles.
Wow, that's great. Scooby-Doo at 50% off. That's hard
I know.
to turn down.
How could you turn down Scooby-Doo?
Yeah, that is awesome. Well, Gwen, listeners to the show know who I am. They know that I'm not Andy Kunka, but Andy Wolverton. And they know probably, if they've been listening, a little bit about my background, being a librarian at a public library. But you're brand new to the show, so tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks, Andy. And first of all, I just want to thank you all for welcoming me here. I'm really excited about this show and about sharing comics with our listeners. A great deal of my work centers on children's and YA literature and comics. I teach both of them in the English department at Western Michigan University in beautiful downtown Kalamazoo, Michigan. But my first comics reading actually took place across the state. You know how Michigan people will hold up their hand to show you where they are? Yeah, well, I grew up near the Thumb in Flint, and I lived in a neighborhood that had a little candy store. And I was a good customer, and so the candy store owner used to let me sit on a milk crate in the back of the store and read all of the new comics that came in. And so back then I would read Mad Magazine, Archie, Richie Rich, Wonder Woman. But if you had told me back then that someday I would grow up to teach comics at a university to college students, I so would not have believed you. So I have to tell you that I have a dream job. And for instance, in the next couple weeks, I'll be teaching Raina Telgemeier's Smile, Jean Luen Yang's American Born Chinese, and a number of other children's comics. So I consider myself to be really lucky. But also, because most of my students are training to become classroom teachers, I also believe what I'm doing is important because I want that group of people to go out and share comics with their students. So part of what I do is just really talking up comics and helping my students learn how to interpret them.
Wow, that's great. And I love that story about the candy store. Is that store still there?
It isn't. Sadly, very
Oh,
little from my childhood is left because, Flint has gone through such a huge change, like a lot of Rust Belt cities. But I tell you, whenever I think of my childhood, that's one of my favorite memories it was a very lovely store. And in the winter, especially, it was very warm. And I would eat my little Hershey's bar and read my comics. And it was good.
and who would have known back then that that would lead to academic work
I know.
and still having a love for comics, and that's great.
That's right.
That's really exciting. Well, Gwen and I, for listeners, we've actually been talking about this show for quite a while, and we've been really excited about what we want to talk about. And in each podcast that we do, and this will be a recurring monthly podcast, we want to talk about two titles, and one title will be a title for a young adult audience, and another title will be for a younger audience, middle grade or elementary school. But what we wanted to do first was spend a little time talking about comics for younger readers because, Gwen, as you and I have both discussed before, there aren't that many podcasts out there talking about comics for younger readers.
That's right. And, the thing is, a lot of times when I introduce comics to my students who are all generally around 20 years old or so, they're shocked to know that there are so many children's comics and that there are such a diverse, set of authors writing on for young people in comics. So it's something that maybe if we want to start off, we could just talk a little bit about, the history of children's comics. Because, for someone who's uninitiated, probably your thought is back to maybe the golden or the silver age when kids read a lot of comic books, but things have changed since then.
They really have, and your story about the candy store really reflects mine a lot. My dad had a grocery store, and it was a small independent grocery store in the South, but he had a rack, a magazine rack that not a spinner rack, but actually a wooden rack where you could put magazines and comics on there, and the comics were always on the bottom. And a lot of times I had to go to the store, so I would sit on that bottom shelf and just read all of these, Spider-Man, Superman, all of these comic books, and probably we had a similar experience of reading some of the same titles, and
Yeah.
To a large degree, and of course you mentioned Mad Magazine, which was not a superhero title, but most of what I read were superhero titles, or in the paper you would read Peanuts or other comic strips like that. But, there wasn't an awful lot of, I guess we could say, diversity in kids' comics back then.
Yeah, and I think too, one of the things our listeners might be interested to know is that children's literature itself has changed. So if the last time you picked up, say, a young adult novel was 1985, there's a whole world out there now that you might want to go and explore. Things have so changed. And there's a couple things that have changed in both worlds, I think, in both comics and in just general text-only literature for children. There's such a profound focus now on first-person narration. That began in the 70s, certainly as a trend, but today it's really prevalent. And you see it coming out in a lot of the memoirs that authors are writing for children now. We've already mentioned Telgemeier once, but she's so phenomenally popular with young readers, and her books Smile and Sisters are both autobiographical, but there's also C.C. Bell's recent El Defo, and many others. Many authors will say that their works are semi-autobiographical too, like Roller Girl. I know Victoria Jameson has said that's based on her own experience with roller derby. So a lot of authors are really trying to draw readers in with that first-person point of view.
And you're exactly right about so many of the changes that have taken place, like you said, since the 90s. And I still experience this a good bit at the library, especially when kids are coming in and they want, a lot of kids want comics or graphic novels. And the parents normally some of them shy away from it, and I think in a lot of ways that we're still suffering in some ways from the Frederick Wortham era, when comics were, lambasted as, evil and degrading, and they're going to corrupt kids' minds. I think a lot of that still carries over, but a lot of parents don't really realize, like what you just said, some of those great titles and some of the wonderful things out there. One of the things that I tell, usually parents don't get too antagonistic, but sometimes they do, and I will give them some information like, did you know that comics have won the Pulitzer Prize? Did you know the comics have won the National Book Award? Comics are recognized as a legitimate format, not just for adults, but also for kids.
Yeah, and it can be challenging too, because a lot of times the way that we come to understand a comic as being good or useful is when we have in our possession a toolkit to analyze comics. But not everybody has that. I mean, even my students who will come to my classroom having read hundreds and hundreds of comic books always say to me after the first couple sessions, wow, I finally have the language to talk about comics in a way that I can now differentiate between these, other than just saying I really liked this one, or the art in this one was cool, and part of what I try to do, and I hope our listeners might be interested in doing, is learning more about comics. And I will never stop learning more about comics, because this is true, Andy. I mean, it's funny, when I teach a comic to my students, they will always see things I didn't see. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that's happened to you when you've done a second or third reading of a comic and you're like, oh, I missed that. So there's always things to hold on to. But one thing that I've started using with my students, and I think it's a really good resource maybe for our listeners, is something that was put out last year by the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. It's a book-length piece called Raising a Reader, How Comics and Graphic Novels Can Help Your Kids Love to Read, and you can get it at any sort of publisher or distributor. But what's really neat about it is there's also a shorter PDF version that's on the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund's website. And it's sort of like a 101 for graphic novels, and it includes both the sort of explanations that you give to parents who are concerned, but it also includes a primer on things like basic terms for comics, like panel and gutter. And it gives parents and educators an idea of how kids really do improve their literacy by reading comics.
I'm glad you mentioned that about improving literacy. That is one of the things too, like I mentioned before, that a lot of times parents will come in and they'll have reluctant readers in their house, and they want to know what they can do. And a lot of times I will steer them to comics, and I'll talk about a little bit of some of the things that you just mentioned, the terminology, and the fact that comics actually have words and pictures. And
right.
for kids that are maybe struggling with some of the words, in a really good comic, even in an average comic, the pictures will help understand the words, so that there's almost this little bridge that's helping them get across some of the tough points. Even if they don't quite understand the words or the vocabulary, they can see visually what's happening, and that really does help them to put things together. So many parents have come back and they've said, this has really been helpful. Not only did they enjoy the comics, but it's helped them become a stronger reader.
That is so true. And I have to laugh because I don't want this to turn into Flint, Michigan's story hour, but the neighborhood that I grew up in Flint, there were a lot of immigrants there who had come from Eastern Europe and Western Europe and Africa and all around the world to come and work in the factories and General Motors factories specifically. And so my neighborhood had tons of people in it who did not speak English. And my mom used to rent from the public library silent movies and play them in our backyard against our garage door, and have all the neighbors over, and everyone could enjoy it because you didn't need to necessarily master English. And I feel that way actually about wordless comics today. I think of Sean Tan's The Arrival, which many of our listeners may know, and it's been a phenomenon around the world because it is truly wordless, and yet my students who read through this comic learn so much about narrative and about the way that story comes together in comics without words at all too. So there's the added sort of benefit of visual literacy, which once parents start to see that and educators see that, I think they really embrace it, and it becomes a great tool.
I think you're exactly right. And, one of the books that we're going to look at today has a really nice nod to that, which I want to bring up a little bit later. But that is such an important aspect of comics. And it's one that doesn't get talked about enough, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. And, the other thing that we might want to talk a little bit about is how we connect readers with comics. Because I know, Andy, part of your job involves that. You've already sort of alluded to talking to parents who come in. But I'm kind of curious, there's so many books that come out every year. It's almost stunning to think about the thousands of children's titles that are released, whether they're text only or comics. I always joke with my friends who study the 19th century or before because, all of their authors are dead. And so they're not like looking at every Wednesday, hundreds of titles barreling towards them that they have to master. So they're sort of lucky in that respect. But for us, we're constantly trying to keep up with stuff that's coming out. And I'm kind of curious of ways that you sort of, decide what good comics are and how you connect kids with comics in that way.
No, that's a great question. I do take quite a bit of time to look at all the new comics that are coming out and the new graphic novels that are coming out that the library has access to. And in our system, we don't really have too many individual comics. We do get Batman, Superman, Action Comics, things like that, but most of them are in the collected editions or in the graphic novel form. And I'm really not in charge of ordering those, but I'm kind of one of the people that we have a certain number of librarians in certain sections. When they see gaps in the collection, they'll send a note and say, we've got this and this and this, but we don't have this. Could we order this? And usually they do a good job of that. On a local level, one of the things that we put together, several librarians and I, we put a binder together, and we did one for the teen section, and we did one for the children's section. And
cool.
It's simply called "What Should I Read Next?" And we've got pages depending on what the people are interested in, the young readers are interested in. There's mystery pages. There is sports books, adventure, science fiction. And on each of those pages, I try to put at least one graphic novel.
Great.
So that gives them, and a lot of times either the child or the parent will say, well, I'm familiar with either Gordon Corman or Mike Lupica, but what's this down here? I'm not familiar with Jean Lewin Yang or something like that. And then that's a great opportunity to say, well, this is a graphic novel. It's just a different way of telling a story, and we can just kind of go from there.
Yeah, and I'm really excited because in the last couple of years, a lot of the award categories and the Eisners have expanded to include so many more comics for young readers. In addition to our sort of making recommendations, I always try and send my students to lists that have been compiled by industry professionals. I'm really excited that in the last couple of years, the Eisner Awards have begun to acknowledge the contributions of comics creators who write for very young children, but also for middle grade and young adults, so you end up every year having around 20 or 25 new titles at your disposal. But also the American Library Association has a graphic novel top 10 page. And they also have a page with young reader recommendations, top 100 novels as voted on by young readers across the country. Both of those sorts of lists are useful. The lists that have been, compiled by industry experts are useful because a lot of my students have to go to head teachers in area high schools or middle schools and say to them, I really want to include a graphic novel. And if they can point to the fact that the graphic novel has won an award, it's a lot easier to get buy-in with their colleagues. All right. But for kids who ask me, they're usually really much more interested that other kids have liked the comic. And so, both sets of lists are ones that I like to use just because I think it's important that if you're faced with thousands of titles and you don't have an awesome librarian like you, Andy, those are other places where our listeners can go to at least have 20 or 30 titles to start off with.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea because parents normally do, like you said, they're normally looking for what are the quality books, what are the award winners, and we certainly try to do that. And every year we try to do an Eisner Award display in the library that covers everything, or as many of them as we can get. And that does help because parents will look at that and there's something that they trust about the awards. And you're right in saying that the kids, a lot of times, the younger readers aren't really that concerned about the awards. They just want something that's going to be good and fun. So,
Right.
but you're right. I mean, we can do both. We can do the things that have been the award winners. And of course, that's not to say that if it won an award that it's not fun, because a lot of times they are. They can win awards and they can be a fun time too. But there should be that balance just in anything that your children do, whether it's watching movies, watching television, reading prose books. You want to have a good combination of things that are fun and things that are going to challenge them too.
Right. And, it's funny. I used to commute in major cities. I lived in Boston and London, and I would sit on the subway car or be squinched in the subway car and look at what everyone was reading. And these were business people, typically with briefcases, clearly individuals who had had some kind of education, right, in the past. And they were reading Westerns and romance novels and mystery novels. And those are wonderful books, but it's so funny because these are the same people who often turn around and say to their own children, and I overhear this all the time in children's book sections, "Oh, you can't read that, it's not improving." Put that Goosebumps down,
Yeah.
put that comic down. And I always sort of laugh, and I always talk to my own students about this. We all need a, moderation in everything, but we also need a broad range of texts to read. And indeed, one of the best things I think that's happening in comics right now is just the support of authors who are writing on really diverse subject matter. Mm-hmm. It's so exciting. I'm part of a movement called We Need Diverse Books. I know you've heard of it too, Andy. And, I really support the idea that we need to have a broader representation of kids in the books that they're reading. And I'm thinking about just recent releases. I know everyone mentions Yang's American-Born Chinese because it is such an important text. But there's a lot of other texts that are dealing with issues like that. I'm thinking of Anya's Ghost by Vera Broskil, which actually is about a Russian immigrant to the United States and her experiences. So it's everything from, sort of immigrant stories to other kinds of texts that are really exciting for young readers. So comics also present sort of a window to the world for young kids.
And, I'm glad, Gwen, that we are seeing so many more diverse titles out there. It's a great thing because, a lot of times as, even as kids or as young people, when we grew up, like we were talking about you at the candy store, me at the grocery store, we see what's there and we think that's all there is.
Right.
But there's so much more out there, and I'm so glad that so many of the other avenues of diversity are being explored because everything is valid, everything is worth exploring. It's a big world, and all of it needs to be represented.
Yeah, I'm thinking we were really lucky last year to have Nate Powell come to Western Michigan University to give a talk on his novel Swallow Me Whole, which came out about 4 years ago, and it deals with two young siblings who are struggling with schizophrenia. And it's a very serious topic. It's a beautiful comic. My students loved it. But while Nate was here, he was talking about how he had been asked to draw the comic March, which now is just such an important series chronicling the life of John Lewis. So there's just one example of a comics creator who is branching out in so many different ways and touching so many different audiences, and really, becoming a voice for young people to understand different experiences, perhaps from their own.
Yeah.
So, it's a great time to be working in children's comics.
It really is. And the exciting thing about it is if you are getting into comics for the first time as a young reader, or if you're getting your children, if you as an adult are getting your children into comics, there's so many avenues to explore. Try not to get overwhelmed. There's a lot out there, and hopefully you can have a librarian or a teacher or a media specialist that you can go to and say, how do I get started? And I know all of those people would be glad to help.
There's a really cool article that I'd like to tell people about. Can I put on my geek hat for a second?
Sure, put it on.
All right, it's on.
I just never take mine off.
Yeah. Oh, you don't? Okay. Well, see, I have mine. I secured the strap. I'm in. Okay. So basically, I'd like to talk about a scholar friend of mine called Joe Sutliff Sanders, who's a professor at Kansas State, and he's written this really interesting article trying to think about the differences between picture books and comics. And one of the things that he talks about is how while children are expected to be able to read picture books on their own, in other words, there's usually a pretty strong correspondence between image and word in a picture book. Now, that's not always the case. All my friends out there who love David Wiesner's Three Pigs and a lot of other awesome books where that disjunction is at the center, don't be upset. But but for the most part, children's picture books are meant to be read by early readers, by parents reading to children. There's sort of that chaperoning going on. Comics, on the other hand, because there's that sort of driving narrative that's a little bit more sophisticated in terms of the sequentiality, right? So you're having to understand panels, gutters, the space between the panels, doing all that kind of interpretation. One of the things that Dr. Sanders talks about is that comics are less likely to be chaperoned narratives. Kids are more likely to read them on their own, and in fact, very often it's a mark of independence when a child picks up a comic and reads it on their own. I'm not doing perfect justice to Joe's argument, so maybe I should just take the geek hat off. But it's an interesting thought for parents too, because there are ways in which I think we can certainly read comics with our kids, but I think it's exciting to see kids go off on their own too and start to choose the comics they want to read, and you can see them sort of building literacy skills even if they're not aware that they're necessarily doing that.
No, I think that's great. And you think about it, and for a lot of young readers, that comics are probably the first time where they get to choose their own books in some ways. And that's a very exciting thing for them to be able to do. I think we both probably had a similar experience with that. But it's a balance of that experiencing things and then having someone to lead us also. That's really exciting.
Yeah, and I often work primarily with graphic novels, but even those are very often cheaper than text-only narratives. Especially texts written by very established authors, which means that kids very often can buy them on their own. That was certainly the case for me with comic books. I read a lot of them for free, thanks to my friend, but I also bought some, and I could afford that, my allowance, whereas going out and buying hardback books would have been really difficult for me as a kid, although I have to admit my parents usually got me books that I wanted at the library or found a way to get them to me. But the reality is, on my own, I could go into the candy store and buy 3 or 4 comics, and that was my own choice. And so it's sort of that time of unchaperoned reading that's really exciting for kids.
Yeah. And, Gwen, one of the other things we had mentioned, too, about talking about is access to comics, which, this leads right into that. You've got your local library, and hopefully they have some good things there. You have our sponsor, DCB Service, which is a great place to go for comics, and the sister company, In Stock Trades, for collected editions and graphic novels. There are so many more avenues, though, that are available. There are digital comics. You can read comics now on your computer, on your tablet. There's so many different ways to experience comics that we didn't really have growing up. Yeah,
and we really just should do a show on webcomics alone. They're so exciting. Yeah. And, so many people who we know today as well-published comics creators started off on the web. And I know Raina Telgemeier, for instance, has talked about the value of having that immediate feedback from young readers, by just writing her right away and saying, I liked this, or I didn't get that, or what's happening. And, it's exciting to even have that sort of venue. I must admit that I spend a lot of time now reading comics online, and I'm always sort of wondering, will this person be the next person who really ends up being published in hardback form? So it's exciting.
It really is. And I do the same thing. And a lot of times when I did the webcomic show with Derek, we would talk about that very thing. Maybe a webcomic did eventually become collected in a print edition or was in process of becoming one. So yeah, there's all the different format issues, and there's just so much to choose from. It's a good problem to have.
It really is. And, this week we have a couple comics that we might want to highlight for our readers, too.
Yeah, let's get into those.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Well, again, as we mentioned early in the show, our format is basically going to be, we're going to cover a comic for young adult readers, and we're going to cover a comic for younger readers, middle grade or younger. Our first title that we're going to take a look at is for the young adult audience, and this title is called Baba Yaga's Assistant, and it's by Marika McCool with art by Emily Carroll, and this comes to us from Candlewick Press. Now, you may be familiar with the term Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga is a character from Slavic folklore, an old woman of supernatural origin who appears deformed, twisted, or just strange. And to those who seek her out, she can either be generous or malicious. And as our story starts, Masha is a young adult who lives with her father, a widower who has remarried a woman named Jennifer. Jennifer and her young daughter, who is basically a little brat named Danny. Danny is her daughter, and both Jennifer and Danny are now going to be a big part of Masha's life, and Masha can't really handle it. She's having a tough time, and Masha remembers all of the wonderful times that she had with her grandmother who raised her and told her stories about her experiences with Baba Yaga and how she used to trick the old hag. You see, Masha's grandmother says during a flashback, Baba Yaga likes resourceful little girls like you, and she rewards those who trick her. So Masha sees a newspaper ad to become Baba Yaga's assistant, and Masha decides that this is going to be her destiny. Gwen, what did you think about the setup for this book?
Well, it's interesting because I had a little bit of trouble getting into the storyline. I thought it was pretty well done. When we get to the part about Baba Yaga's assistant, I probably would have liked just a little bit more background. So when I was reading through that, I would have understood the cultural background to it a little bit better. But it was an interesting story. I'm kind of interested what you thought.
Well, one of the things that I liked about it, I've heard of Baba Yaga more in the realm of music, having been a music major and a music teacher for many years. And, the famous Baba Yaga thing is the hut of Baba Yaga from Mussorgsky. I can't believe I'm forgetting that, but it's from classical literature. But, the thing that I liked about this is the creators do a pretty good job of setting up the Baba Yaga mythology without getting bogged down in a history lesson.
Right.
Which I thought was pretty good. But, for me, really the meat of the story is, initially at least, is this inner struggle that Masha is going through. She wants to be a part of this new family, but she just doesn't feel useful there. And combining this struggle with the idea that death and bereavement often do cause us to have to start over. And, there are choices to be made, and sometimes those choices are scary.
Yeah, and the scenes in the graveyard are very poignant. I think they're lovely in a way, a meditation on grief. I found that to be the part of the comic with which I identified the most. In fact, and I think young readers might as well, because it sort of expresses that inner conflict that Masha has.
One of the things I really liked about how Masha was her character was developed is her strength and confidence. And she gets that from her grandmother, and we get a lot of flashbacks to the times when they were together. And one of the things I really liked about what Emily Carroll does with this is the color scheme for those scenes. the flashback scenes have a different hue compared to the main story. And in most of those scenes, Masha is depicted as a younger girl, so younger readers probably won't be confused with the flashbacks. I don't think they would really have much trouble with that. But the different art styles are also used when Masha remembers stories and tales from her childhood, or in some cases she's reading from one of the books that she's brought along with her. So I thought the variation in art styles worked really well.
It was really effective. I loved this when the storybook, the panels become storybook pages, which I thought was super effective in showing an embedded narrative.
Yeah.
So I don't think a reader would have any trouble following along. And I do love the use of color. That's something I'm going to get at in a minute with Sunny Side Up as well.
Yeah.
We sometimes don't always, highlight coloring first or the work of a colorist first, but in this case, it really is done effectively.
Yeah, the colorists in both of these books have done just wonderful work. And, we spoke a little bit at the beginning about, how to determine if a book is worth reading. And a lot of times when a young reader looks at something, they just look, as anybody would, they take a quick glance at the pictures. And they want to see, is this a colorful book? Is this not a colorful book? What type of visuals am I going to be getting? And there's so much richness in this book as far as not only the color, but as we have mentioned, the different types of art styles.
Yeah, and the cover is super creepy.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So if you're looking for the kid who really enjoys a good ghost story, or perhaps likes Gothic literature, or the embedded narratives and the cover illustration, I think that's going to draw that reader in.
I think it will too. We get a lot of kids and a lot of their parents that come in, and they'll sometimes they'll say, "I'm looking for a scary story," and I'll say, "How scary?" And they'll say, "Not very scary." And this is a great book because you can just show them the cover and you can ask them, "Is this too scary?" And if they nod, that's too scary, to go to something else. But I think most of the younger readers that we get in the library, they would look at this and think, "Yeah, I think I might want to try that." But no, I think it is a very good representation of what you're going to get inside the book, because Baba Yaga on the cover does look a little scary. You've got the house and you've got the claws. It does look a little scary, but not, it could be much more terrifying, I guess it could.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would compare it to Vera Brosgil's Anya's Ghost in some ways. It's a text that starts off and you think this is just one of those kind of teen narratives where a young woman is having trouble fitting in with her friends. But as the story unfolds, it becomes darker and more frightening, and towards near the end, almost terrifying, really, at least in terms of where the story goes with the actual ghost. I found this to be, in some ways, a little bit different, but that focus on, a very common trope in children's folklore and children's literature, the fear of being engulfed or eaten by the other, is very central to this text, as it is, interestingly, in Anya's Ghost. Anya falls down that hole and you don't know what's going to happen to her soul. There's some of that going on here, too.
Yeah, there definitely is. And one of the things that I liked about the book is we talked a little bit about Masha's strength and confidence. A lot of times kids, they won't really come out and say this, but you get the feeling that a young reader is reading through something and it's something scary. And I think in a lot of times they will put themselves in the place of that character and ask themselves, what would I do in this situation? Would I be scared? Right. Would I be heroic? And actually there's a really, really nice scene on early in this book. It's on page 22. I don't know if you have your book with you. But on that page, Masha finds Baba Yaga's house for the first time, and it's kind of a rundown wooden house, and the house actually stands on chicken legs.
I know.
So it's such a bizarre thing, and we see that, and at first we see Baba Yaga at a distance. She's standing in the doorway. Then I guess what we would call in the movies would be a medium shot, and then a close-up. And each time she's drawn creepier and creepier. And the next panel we see Masha a little bit frightened saying, I heard you need an assistant. And then these large letters spelling ha 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 ha, and you know that Baba Yaga's just, laughing hysterically. And then the page's final panel, there's a long horizontal panel, and we see Masha standing toe to toe with Baba Yaga, and it's almost like they're having this face off. And Baba Yaga says, "And you think you're up to the job?" And the great thing is Masha just stands there unflinching, and she just gives this simple, bold yes.
Yeah.
And that tells us so much about both characters without overdoing it.
Yeah. I have to tell you that the chicken house, the house on the chicken legs, it just cracked me up. And just, so listeners know, when Baba Yaga's house drops, the chicken legs pop out on either side with a huge whoomp. And all I could think of was intertextuality with the Wicked Witch and Wizard of Oz.
Oh, I didn't think about that, but that's so perfect.
Feet sticking out of the house. Yeah. To me, there was just sort of a little subtle echo back to another young woman who has to face, a difficult situation with a witch-like character. So I swear Wizard of Oz isn't everything. Or maybe I'm just seeing it. Maybe it's just...
No, that's great. I'm glad you saw that. I completely didn't get that, but that is perfect.
But a house on chicken legs anyway is just, I thought that was awesome.
Yeah, I think it is too. It's a really fun book, and I think from what we've told you about it so far, parents, you would probably know if this is the type of book that your young reader would like. I mean, it is filled with a lot of images that are somewhat scary, but not. I don't think they're that intense, depending on the age of the reader. But again, I think one of the most important things is the strength and confidence that Masha shows throughout. And does she get scared throughout the book? Yes, she does. But she also has that determination that makes a strong protagonist come alive, and it does. And the creators do a really good job with that.
Yeah, and there's some extra textual information that I thought was helpful too, including a sketchbook where Emily Carroll shows a lot of the sketches that she made of the characters. And in some ways that might help to diffuse some anxiety that readers have about the character of Baba Yaga, because you sort of see the manner in which the artist works with that image to create the scariness, and it almost in some ways makes it easier to mediate than we see it in the text. So I really like that option, or that aspect of it too.
I was glad they put that in as well. And when I see things like that, I always wonder, when it's done well, like it is here. I'm not much of an artist, but a lot of times I will just grab a pencil and I'll think, that looks like something I could do. And I wonder how many young readers will look at this and think, I think I could draw her. I think I could draw Baba Yaga's house.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's interesting. I was just listening to a interview with a comics creator, Matt Holm, who was talking about seeing a film clip of Charles Schulz drawing, or I think it was Charles Schulz, and saying to himself, he sits at a desk and he uses a pen and he draws. I might be able to do that.
Yeah.
So you never know when kids are getting inspired, or by what. And I think this is a really nice touch that sort of is, brings to home the material aspect of the text as well, the way it was produced and the thought and care that went into the images that are in it.
Yeah.
So...
The author of this book, Marika McCool, is a writer, illustrator, and educator, and she has an MFA in Writing for Children from Simmons College. Baba Yaga's Assistant is McCool's very first graphic novel, and I hope it will be the first of many.
Yeah, me too. Well, the text that I'm reviewing does have some things in common with the one that you have looked at. It's called Sunny Side Up, and it's a semi-autobiographical middle grade comic by Jennifer Holm and Matthew Holm. It was just released in August by Graphics, which is an imprint of Scholastic. The text comes in at just over 200 pages, and it covers 6 months in the life of Sunshine Lewin, a 10-year-old Pennsylvania girl who's sent down to West Palm Beach, Florida, to spend the summer with her retired grandfather so that her parents can help her older brother Dale deal with a substance abuse problem. Now, our listeners may know Jennifer Holm and Matthew Holm as the team behind such successful children's graphic novel series as Baby Mouse and the awesomely titled Squish. And I know, Andy, probably a lot of kids come into the library asking for both of those.
They do.
And they're both really very lighthearted. This text is a little bit different. Holm is also known as an author of text-only narratives for children. She won the Newbery in 1998 for a historical novel called Our Only May Amelia. And she, in addition to dealing with immigrant stories, she also deals with ethics. Her most recent book, called The 14th Goldfish, deals with science ethics. And that might sound like it's not the most entertaining topic for kids, but here's the thing about Jennifer Holm. She is really, really good at injecting humor and sort of especially gentle humor into very serious subject matter. And that is certainly the case here with Sunny Side Up. I think kids will appreciate the relationship that Sunny develops with her grandfather, who's a lovely gentleman who calls her old girl, which I thought was such a great touch.
Yeah.
And so ironic because he lives in a retirement community, and Sunny has gone down there to live with him, and she interacts with all of the friends that her grandpa has, and that's a really sweet part of the comic as well. But there's another aspect to Sunny Side Up that I think is really interesting and quite moving, and that is the character of Sunny, who's loosely based upon Jennifer Holm, ends up seeing sort of in herself the resilience that she finds in the books that she begins to read about Superman, Batman, the Incredible Hulk, etc. In a way, Sunny Side Up is sort of a nod to superhero comics and how kids can read superhero comics and get out of that kind of resilience that you were talking about in Baba Yaga's Assistant with Masha. So I think that there's a parallel there. But it's also interesting because at one point, Sunny reads the Hulk, and she's thinking about the relationship that she had with her brother Dale. He was her older brother and was very close to her, but he begins to sort of withdraw. And she starts to think about the transformation of the Hulk from mild-mannered Bruce Banner into a raging and angry being, and she begins to recognize that's what's happening with her brother. And even though that doesn't in any way solve the issue of what's going on with Dale, it does give her a way of kind of understanding to a certain extent that what's happened, it's not that Dale has changed as a person, the substances he's taking are changing him. But it sort of helps her to sort of connect to that experience a little bit more, I think.
I really like the way, like you mentioned, that comics are integrated within this graphic novel and the important role that they play. One of the things I know from, although my family didn't suffer anything like this, a sibling with or a child with substance abuse problems. I mean, every family's got something, right? But
right.
A lot of times when you're very young and something like this happens, something traumatic or something that shakes up the family, one of the things that affects those children, they normally have some type of identity problem. And a lot of times they will think, well, maybe this was my fault. Or even if they don't think that, they might think, things have changed. Where do I fit in now?
Right.
And this is such a wonderful way that the Holm siblings have handled this is through comic book metaphors. One of my favorites it happens on page 135, and it's a scene where Sunny and Buzz, her friend, are reading a Superman comic. Buzz points to Superman and says, "That's the superpower I'd want. Wouldn't that be cool to be able to fly?" Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Sunny says, "I guess." And Buzz says, "Well, what superpower would you want?" And Sunny says, "Invisibility." And that answer makes so much sense the further we read. I don't want to get too much into it in the book. I mean, that is such a telling answer for that character at that time.
Yeah, and you bring up something, which is that this is another text that is told through flashbacks primarily. So we have Sunny in the present with her grandfather, but she's thinking back to things that have happened in her family, and that sort of concept of invisibility shows up later in her memories, and it allows a young reader to understand that connection. So it's a nice bridge between sort of Sunny's thinking about why she would want to be invisible, and then we as readers get to see exactly why she would want that superpower. So I agree, it's a really lovely touch, I think. And in fact, I would argue that this text advocates for the importance of things like comic books, movies, television shows as springboards for kids, right? As they're trying to deal with difficult situations,
Yeah, exactly. Because the kids have to have some kind of support. And sometimes that comes in the form of another friend, but sometimes that comes from things like reading comic books or reading books or watching a television show or a movie. They gravitate towards that, and there are certain things that give us strength as children and as adults. And that is what really raises Sunny out of this really bad time that she's going through, and it helps her to deal with it.
Right. And, it's interesting because educators often talk about the importance of series fiction for children because, a lot of times parents get a little bit aggravated when kids want to read the same thing over and over again. So, Sunny perhaps reading all of the issues of Hulk instead of reading an improving book. But, one of the things we found is that when children are experiencing crisis, and frankly, growing up in and of itself can be quite a challenge. Having that kind of predictability, the reliability of familiar characters, familiar scenes, familiar conflicts, actually is very comforting to kids. It helps them to ground themselves. And I think that Jennifer and Matt Holm do a wonderful job in this text of showing the way that Sunny grounds herself through the reading of comics. So I think that's really a beautiful tribute to comics in a way.
I do too. I really appreciate also how much humor is in the book. I mean, it's just loaded with just funny event after a funny event. And one of the early jokes that happens is, Sunny gets to her grandfather's retirement community, and he lives in West Palm Beach, which is about 2 hours from Disney World in Orlando. And every time Sunny's grandfather announces he's got big plans for them today, Sunny thinks, oh, great, we're going to drive to Disney World. But it usually turns out to be a trip to the post office or
the bank.
Or the bank. It's big plans. So there's that running joke. And like you mentioned, the other senior residents at the place they're just a lot of fun, and you feel bad for Sunny because she's hanging out with people that have no interest in what she's interested in, but it is it's sweet without getting too sweet.
Yeah, there's no saccharine here.
No.
But I would also say that Jennifer Holm is really good at showing that the grandparents and the grandchildren may be a little bit out of touch with each other's interests, but that they love each other. And, there's a sort of respectful humor. Yeah. It's not, denigratory the way a lot of broad television sitcoms will play elderly folks as being completely out of touch. That's not really what's going on here. It's a really sweet, gentle portrayal, but it doesn't get saccharine either. It's a nice balance. I think Jennifer Holm is really good at that, actually, of portraying adults who might be a little out of touch with kids, but doing it in a way that you recognize. I know myself, I see myself in some of the adults in this text. So, I think she has a really good way of actually handling that, I think. There are a few other things that I think are really significant about this particular comic. One of them is that it's focalized realistically through a 10-year-old's point of view. And for that reason, readers never get a complete understanding of Sunny's brother's problems or their resolution, which actually I think adds an element of realism to the text. When you're 10 years old, you don't always know what's going on in the adult world. And so I think that Holm does a nice job of giving readers just enough information to get a context without so much detail that the story shifts away from Sunny.
I agree with that. And you know, one of the things that I liked about it too is another one of the aspects of being young and recognizing that there's a problem that you can't do anything about. This does come up in a different way. Once Sunny is with her grandfather, she knows that there's a problem back home that she can't fix. She can't do anything about it. But then, as the more she's with her grandfather, she realizes that he has a problem too.
Right.
A different problem, and that may be something that she can do something about. So there's that duality there that, you know, she can't help here, but maybe she can help here, which adds to her depth as a character.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. And I would also say, sort of linking back to what you were talking about before, that this comic benefits substantially from the color work. And in this case, it was done by Lark Pien, who is a comics creator in her own right, but she also is really well known for being the colorist of Jean Luen Yang's American-Born Chinese and Boxers and Saints. And in Sunny Side Up, Pien utilizes a palette that reflects Sunny's name, Sunshine, right? Lots of yellows, lots of oranges, but they're really muted. And I think that's significant because, first of all, it shows that, you know, Sunny is in a reflective mood on this vacation. She's worried about what's going on at home. She has her own concerns about you know, fitting in at the retirement community. So it's not like we're looking at shocking, bright colors. They're very muted. But I think it serves a second purpose as well, and I'll be really interested, Andy, to see if you saw this as well. In some ways, there's a haziness to the coloring that contributes to a feeling of nostalgia that I think is a powerful component of this comic. The novel is set in 1976, the bicentennial year. I myself was a preteen at this time, and as I was reading the comic, I felt transported back to the era of the Dorothy Hamill haircut and Tiger Beat magazine.
Tiger Beat, yeah.
And, you know, so in that respect, I would actually call Sunny Side Up a dual audience text, because adults who are my age and a little younger, in other words, the parents of today's kids, I think will appreciate the nods to a time when kids hung out playing records in their room, eating Jiffy Pop popcorn, and also not always knowing what was going on in the adult world. This is the world before the internet. It's the world before texting and kids having access to so much information. And that doesn't mean that kids today always understand that information they have access to. But I think this comic does a really good job of showing what it meant to be a kid when there really was a strong demarcation between adult-possessed information and kid-possessed information. And I think this is a text that will therefore appeal to adults a little bit, thinking about their own childhood. But that said, I think it's still going to appeal to young kids as well, in part because of Sunny's resilience, which is a nice link back to Masha. Sunny does learn to, as you say, stand up to issues she can control in her life, and stand up for her grandfather in some interesting ways. And so, you know, it's a beautiful comic to look at. I think there's a certain amount of nostalgia for the past, and yet it feels very current in other ways.
I completely agree. This is a book that has children appeal, young readers appeal, as well as adult appeal. The thing that happens a lot, and I see this in the library a lot too, and it bothers me, but I understand why it happens. A lot of times the parents will give their children books, graphic novels, comics, whatever, and they'll say, "Here, read this." And what the subtext is, this has nothing for me, but you're going to like it. But this is a book that adults and children can read, and both, like you said, there's a lot to be gained. There's a lot of things in here that a child won't get. A lot of the in-jokes, like you said, a lot of the 70s things, the 70s fashions, the hairstyles, the products that our younger readers just not going to get. But the adult will, and this would even be a great way to connect, you know, with that young reader and say, you know, my hair was like that, or, you know, I had one of those hang in there Friday's Coming posters on my wall, or, you know, and so it's a great way to actually, I hate to say bridge a gap, but it could be, and it could be one of those books that brings readers of all ages together, which is a good thing. I don't mean that to sound like a cliche, but it is one of those books that has something for everybody.
Yeah, and I want to give a hat tip here to Matthew Holm, because we haven't talked as much about him. There's an interesting story there. Jennifer is older than Matt. Matt, I think, was the baby in the family, if I remember correctly. They met up in New York City for dinner about maybe it's a decade ago now, and came up with this idea for Baby Mouse. And since then, they've been working collaboratively a great deal. But, Jennifer had already been established as a novelist. Matt had a long career as a graphic artist, and he has an incredible attention to detail. His line style is very close to the clear line style. Mm-hmm. It's not exactly there. He does a lot of shading. There's some things he does that would separate it. But I would sort of equate his line style to that of, maybe Charles Schulz. Mm-hmm. Is a good comparison to a certain extent. But he's such a detail-oriented artist. I don't know if you noticed, but I was looking at the scene where Sunny arrives in Florida and she's waiting for her grandpa at the airport. And the people who are in the background are just amazing. There's a young woman with a Rolling Stones T-shirt on. Yeah. There's all these little tiny subtle details from the 70s that are just in the backgrounds. They're not integral to the way the story moves forward per se, but they create such a realistic world that the characters inhabit. And I really appreciate that. And I want to make sure that we give, credit to Matt for his, his really amazing attention to detail in this comic.
Gwen, I was listening this morning to a podcast that you told me about, and I'm so glad you told me about it. And it's a podcast called The Yarn. And the episode that I listened to was, I think it's season 1, episode 8, Jennifer and Matthew Holm. And he actually talks about the amount of research that he did on this book, and getting, pictures from the era, seeing what the cars looked like, because he said, I wanted to, it takes place in 1976, so I had to make sure that I didn't have a car that came out in 1977, or a style of clothes that didn't really catch on until 1978. So you're right. I mean, he's done a tremendous amount of research in getting these details right, and the book reflects it. It really is much stronger for it.
Yeah, it's interesting because that certainly is the case with Raina Telgemeier, too. I couldn't help but to think of Smile when I was reading this text. I was actually living in San Francisco at the time that Smile takes place. Among other things, the Pre de Loma earthquake occurs in the middle of that text and has a sort of impact on Raina. Let me tell you, it had an impact on me, too, since I was on the 33rd floor of a skyscraper. But that's the power, I think, of a really good comics creator who's doing work that's either autobiographical, or in this case it's semi-autobiographical, and does a really good job of paying attention to those details. Because as someone who was living in the Bay Area at the same time as a younger Raina Telgemeier, there's so many little subtleties there that just add such a richness to the story. And I think it's a good idea to sort of point those out, because kid readers may not always pick up on those things, as you said. But as they become sort of more sophisticated readers of comics, they return to these texts. I think they may pick up on those things. And one thing about comics, it's true with text-only narratives as well. If we read things repeatedly, we just are always picking up new details, things we didn't pick up before. And that's part of the excitement of reading comics.
It sure is. It is for me, and I know that it's the same for you, too, and probably a lot of our listeners as well.
Yep, absolutely.
I have to tell you about one scene that I can't let go.
Okay.
It's my favorite scene in the whole book, and it's very short, and it happens just after Sunny. Well, she's met Buzz, and Buzz has invited her over to his house, and Sunny meets Buzz's dad, and she sees all of the comics that he has and all the collected editions. And this was in 1976. Those. At that time, some of the books that he has on his shelf, Prince Valiant, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, Flash Gordon, Terry and the Pirates. He's got all these books. I mean, at that time, those were not really easy to get. But there's a great scene where the kids are looking at that, and Buzz's dad comes in and says, "Maria and I came over from Cuba during the Revolution. I couldn't read or speak any English, but when I looked at comics, it seemed so logical. You might even say that Superman taught me English."
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
That is a beautiful moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, the picture, it's really cute because the picture on the facing page is of Sunny standing in front of this bookcase. And the little emanata coming out of her head, she looks like she is a literal sunshine.
Yeah.
There's these rays coming out of these golden rays coming out of her head, and it's like you just get this idea that this is the moment for her, that aha moment, which will change her life. And as this is a semi-autobiographical text, you have to wonder, if this actually happened to Ginny, and this is really where her love of comics began. But I thought the portrayal of Buzz's parents was extremely poignant. The way that they sort of seem to intuit Sunny's, kind of under the surface sadness and anxiety, and the generosity of the father, and giving her whatever comics she wants, which is just a really sweet moment too.
It's a wonderful scene. It's one wonderful scene and a wonderful book.
And I just want to say one other thing to maybe entice people to read this book. There's a scene that I don't want to talk about because I don't want to spoil it for readers, but I want to allude to it. And it refers to the volcano at Pompeii. I remember as a kid, for whatever reason, that was a fascination with me and a lot of my classmates when we got to study ancient, Italy, and we're learning about that. And it shows up in this text in a really also very heartfelt way. Interestingly. And so as readers are reading, be on the lookout for that. This is really a very rich comic. I think we're able to point to so many places in the comic because there's just so much going on in it, but it all flows together beautifully.
It really does. And again, this is a book by Graphics, which is an imprint of Scholastic. So this should be a book that is probably available to most young readers, again, at libraries, at local comic shops, maybe even in school media centers too.
Right. I think it's very accessible, and it's a great comic. There's a lot of wonderful scaffolding that goes on in this comic in terms of you can really feel that Jennifer and Holm and Matthew Holm understand child readers, especially kids who would be the intended audience for this text, right? Kids who are in 4th, 5th, 6th grade primarily. And they understand where they are. And by the end of this comic, a young kid who didn't know a lot about superhero comics would know a lot more about them, might come to even understand the way comics are something that they might want to explore more. So I think it's a great text all around.
Yeah. Well, Gwen, we've looked at two really, really fun books, really important books, I think, too, for our very first show. And I've had a lot of fun talking about them, and I hope you have too.
Oh, absolutely. This has been really enjoyable.
Yeah, well, it's been fun.
We should do this again.
I think maybe we will. I think we will try to do it again. But if you, our listeners, are looking for a good place to get comics, you cannot do any better than DCB Service or their sister company, In Stock Trades. And you'll find several great titles for huge discounts there. And when you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think of these books. You can contact us by going to our website at comicsalternative.com. And on the right-hand side of your browser, you should see a tab that reads Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or, if you want to contact us the old-school way, you can call us on the telephone. Do you remember the telephones, Gwen?
Wow. I hope the person who's calling in has the rotary dial.
I hope so too. If you don't have the rotary dial, it's just not worth it. But you can call us on the telephone at 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can contact us by email at 2guys at comicsalternative.com. Or if you want to get in touch with us individually, I'm Wolverton at comicsalternative.com. And Gwen, how can people reach you?
I'm Gwen, Gwen, at comicsalternative.com. Oh, and hey, you know what? There's that thing called Twitter.
Oh, yeah, the Twitter thing.
And that's where we're going to announce our new content to our podcast and updates to our blogs. And our Twitter handle is at 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. And you can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, and Pinterest. We even have a YouTube channel, so you can access us that way. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, you can stream us on Stitcher, you can find us on TuneIn, and you can discover every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary on our blog at comicsalternative.com.
Well, until next time, I'm Gwen.
And I'm Andy. See you later.
See ya.